The Valeri were a species of peace. For thousands of years, they had lived in harmony on their lush homeworld, a planet rich with green forests and clear, tranquil seas. Their cities were marvels of advanced technology, their culture an endless pursuit of knowledge. Disease had been all but eradicated. The Valeri believed themselves invincible, protected by their superior science and their deep understanding of the universe. But something had changed. It started as a whisper among the scholars, a rumor that began to grow in hushed tones within the walls of the Valeri Research Institute. A new plague had appeared, one that defied their understanding, one that their advanced medical systems could not stop. The symptoms were strange: extreme fatigue, fever, and a quickening of the heart rate. Within days, a small group of Valeri had fallen ill, and by the time the healers realized what was happening, the plague was already spreading rapidly. It moved like wildfire, sweeping through cities, and the once peaceful and thriving world of the Valeri became a land of sickness and fear. The Valeri had no name for the plague, for it was unlike anything they had encountered before. Their most brilliant minds studied the disease for weeks, but it seemed immune to every cure, every treatment they tried. The infection spread faster than their technology could keep up. Panic began to set in. As the situation grew worse, the elders of the Valeri gathered for an emergency council meeting. These were the leaders who had guided their civilization for generations, and now they faced a challenge greater than any they had encountered. The disease was not just attacking individuals, it was attacking their very existence. "Do we have any answers?" the High Elder, Korlak, asked. His voice was low but filled with a sense of urgency. "Nothing," replied Talus, a senior scientist. "Every medical procedure we've tried has failed. Our best minds have been unable to isolate the cause. The virus is unlike anything we've seen before." Korlak's brow furrowed in thought. "Are we certain that this is not a result of the old stories?" "What stories?" Talus asked, puzzled. "You know the ones, the stories about humans," Korlak replied. "They have always been told in whispers. Their blood, their presence, some believed it to be dangerous, even toxic." The room fell silent. The Valeri had encountered humans only once, many centuries ago, during a brief and unsuccessful attempt at peace negotiations. The Valeri had dismissed them as a primitive species. Humans had been thought of as nothing more than a curiosity, an irrelevant species that did not pose a real threat. But over time, the Valeri had come to believe something far more dangerous, that human blood was poison. The rumors that humans were capable of causing harm to the Valeri had never been confirmed, but they had taken hold in the minds of some, passed down through generations. It had been widely accepted that contact with human blood could bring about a disaster. But now, with their world in chaos, the Valeri began to question everything they thought they knew. Could this disease somehow be connected to humans? The old fears resurfaced, casting a shadow over the council. "Perhaps we should not have dismissed the old tales so quickly," another elder suggested. "Perhaps the humans were right all along. Maybe their blood is poisonous to us." The room was filled with murmurs of doubt and uncertainty. No one had dared consider the possibility before, but now, in the face of extinction, the old stories suddenly felt more real. "There must be another way," Talus said, shaking her head. "We cannot afford to believe in superstitions. We need facts." But deep down, they all knew that time was running out. Across the vast expanse of space, on a distant and lonely planet, Jonathan Cross sat in the cockpit of his damaged spacecraft. A former soldier, Jonathan had long since left the service, wandering the stars in search of something: freedom, adventure, or perhaps a place where he could find peace. His ship had been damaged in an unexpected storm, and he had crash-landed on the Valeri world without warning or preparation. Jonathan wasn't sure what kind of world he had landed on. The landscape outside his ship's windows was breathtaking, lush, green, and peaceful, with towering trees and sparkling rivers. But the beauty was marred by the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As he walked cautiously through the alien terrain, he noticed strange structures in the distance. Tall, sleek buildings unlike anything he had seen before. The air was clean and fresh, and yet the silence was unnerving. When Jonathan had first arrived, he had been unaware of the plague threatening the Valerie. He only knew that his ship was damaged, and he needed help. But the moment he approached the nearest settlement, he was met with fear. The Valerie seemed to know he wasn't one of their own. They avoided him, their faces filled with suspicion. When he tried to speak to one of them, they backed away quickly. Jonathan had heard of alien races with strict customs, but this was different. Something was terribly wrong. It wasn't long before he was detained by the Valerie authorities, who insisted on quarantining him. They feared he might be carrying a disease, something that could make the situation worse. Jonathan had no idea why they were so afraid. His only concern was finding a way off their planet, but it was clear that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. As he sat in a holding cell, Jonathan could only wonder what was happening. Little did he know, his arrival on their world might hold the key to their survival. Jonathan sat in the cold, sterile holding cell, feeling both frustrated and confused. He had been detained by the Valerie authorities not long after his crash landing, their faces filled with suspicion as they examined him. No one spoke to him directly. He had tried to explain that he was just a traveler, but it was clear they didn't trust him. From where he sat, Jonathan could see the city through the small, reinforced window of his cell. Tall buildings stretched high into the sky, their smooth, silver surfaces reflecting the bright sun. There were no vehicles zooming by, no people rushing in the streets. Everything seemed still, quiet, as if the world was holding its breath. It had been hours since the Valerie had placed him here, but no one had come to speak with him. He had tried to communicate with the guards, but they wouldn't even look at him. The silence made him uneasy. What kind of people were these, and why were they treating him like this? A sudden sound echoed through the hallway outside his cell, footsteps growing louder until the door to his cell opened. A tall Valerie stepped inside. She had blue skin, shimmering under the lights, and large, expressive eyes that gave her an air of wisdom. Her name, he would later learn, was Talus, a scientist who had been studying the plague that had struck her people. "We need to talk," Talus said. Her voice was calm but firm, her gaze not unkind. Jonathan stood up, stretching his legs. "I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just want to get off this planet. My ship's busted, and I need help." Talus didn't seem to hear him. Instead, she studied him carefully, as if trying to see something beneath his words. "There is something we need to understand about you, human. Something that might be important." Jonathan furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" "We believe you may be the key to stopping a terrible disease that is spreading across our world. You see, the plague. It has a strange effect on us. We don't understand it yet. But it seems that you are immune." "Immune?" Jonathan repeated, confused. "What plague? I didn't even know you had a plague." Talus looked at him with a mixture of concern and urgency. "This disease is unlike any we have encountered. It spreads quickly, and our best efforts to stop it have failed. Our healers, our technology, everything we've tried. Nothing works. The plague is taking lives by the day. But when we found you, you didn't get sick. You survived." Jonathan's eyes widened. "Wait a second. Are you telling me I'm immune to whatever's killing you?" "Exactly," Talus said, nodding. "We don't know how or why, but your blood doesn't react to the virus. It seems to fight it off." Jonathan's mind raced. He had no idea how that was possible. He wasn't a doctor, nor had he ever been involved with any kind of scientific research. He was just a soldier, a man who had spent most of his life fighting in battles that had nothing to do with diseases. But here he was, the supposed savior of an entire alien race. "All right," Jonathan said slowly. "If you think I can help, what do you want me to do?" Talus motioned for him to follow her. "We need to understand why your blood is so special. We need to study it, to find out what makes you different. Only then can we begin to create a cure for our people." Jonathan hesitated. "You want to use me as a test subject, don't you?" Talis gave him a nod, her expression serious. "Yes, we need your help. You don't have to stay here long, but if your blood can help save us, we must know more about it. Will you cooperate?" Jonathan glanced around the sterile room. He didn't like the idea of being poked and prodded, but he knew he didn't have much of a choice. The Valerie were desperate, and if his blood really could save them, he didn't want to stand by and watch them suffer. "All right," he said reluctantly. "But if I'm doing this, I need to know more about the disease and how it works." Talis seemed pleased with his answer. "Of course, let me explain." She led him down a narrow corridor, and soon they entered a bright laboratory. The walls were lined with advanced equipment, and scientists moved around the room, all busy with their tasks. One of them, a Valerie named Sira, was waiting by a large glass containment chamber. Jonathan's eyes followed her as she began preparing a series of machines, including a strange device that looked like it could extract blood. "Are you sure about this?" Jonathan asked again. "I've never done anything like this before. What exactly do you need from me?" "We will draw a sample of your blood," Talis explained. "We'll analyze it to understand why it resists the plague. Then we'll use that information to try to develop a treatment. It's our best hope." Jonathan nodded, feeling a knot of unease in his stomach. He had no idea what the Valerie would find, or if it would even work. But in that moment, he realized that his situation had changed. He wasn't just a lost traveler anymore. He had become the hope for an entire species, and as strange as it seemed, his blood might just be their salvation. As Talis prepared him for the procedure, Jonathan glanced out the window. The skies above the city were darkening, a storm brewing on the horizon. It felt as though the world was on the edge of something far bigger than he could comprehend. And for the first time, Jonathan understood the weight of the situation. His next steps could decide the future of the Valerie, and perhaps even his own future as well. Jonathan sat in the bright, sterile laboratory, feeling a mix of confusion and unease. His blood was being drawn, extracted slowly by the advanced machinery the Valerie had set up. He had never been a fan of needles, and now he was surrounded by alien technology, all while being treated like an unwilling patient. Still, the thought of helping the Valerie escape their plague kept him from pulling away. He had to remind himself why he was doing this. These beings, strange and untrusting as they were, might hold the key to answers he couldn't even begin to understand. Talis stood beside him, watching as the machines processed his blood. Her eyes were focused, a look of intensity behind them. "We're almost done," she said softly, though Jonathan could tell there was more on her mind than just the procedure. "I still don't get it," Jonathan muttered, his voice sounding thick in the quiet room. "How could I be immune to something that's affecting all of you? I'm just a human. I'm not special." Talis didn't immediately respond. Instead, she turned to the monitor that displayed his blood sample. The results were flashing across the screen. Graphs, numbers, and codes he didn't understand. She studied them carefully, her eyes narrowing. "It's more than just immunity," she said, almost to herself. "It's something unique." Jonathan looked at her. "What do you mean?" Talis turned back to face him. "Your blood has an unusual property, a combination of traits we've never seen before in any species. It's almost as if your immune system adapts to threats on a deeper level than we thought possible." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "That sounds complicated." "It is," she replied, her expression serious. "We believe your immune system has evolved in a way that is different from ours. It seems to anticipate diseases, even before they can fully develop. We've never encountered anything like it." Jonathan leaned back slightly in his chair. This was getting more bizarre by the minute. First, he found himself stranded on an alien world. Now his blood was being studied because it could save an entire race. It didn't make sense, but he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Before he could say anything more, Another Valerie scientist entered the room, a tall male with silver skin and black eyes. His name was Kiran, and he was one of the leading researchers studying the plague. He nodded at Talus before addressing Jonathan. "We've been running tests on the disease, but nothing has worked," Kiran said, his voice calm but filled with concern. "We've isolated the virus, but no matter what we try, we can't find a way to stop it. The virus mutates too quickly for our medicines to keep up. But your blood, it's different." Jonathan wasn't sure how to respond. He had never seen anything like the Valerie's technology, let alone their ability to isolate and study a virus. To him, it was all out of his depth. But if his blood could really help them, he wasn't going to just sit back and do nothing. Talus spoke up again, her voice filled with determination. "We need to know what makes your immune system so resilient. If we can isolate the key factor in your blood, we can replicate it. Maybe then, we'll have a chance of saving our people." Jonathan felt a deep sense of unease. "And what happens after you've studied my blood? What if this isn't enough? What if your people, your entire race, just dies anyway?" Kiran's eyes softened, but his voice was firm. "We have no other options. If your blood holds the answer, it could be the last hope we have." Jonathan couldn't deny the truth in his words. The Valerie had tried everything they knew, and the plague was still spreading faster than they could manage. The situation was dire, and if he didn't help, they might all be doomed. "I'll help," Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "But how do we even begin?" Talus nodded, already turning back to the machines. "We will begin by analyzing your white blood cells. We believe they contain the key to your immunity. Once we understand that, we can begin developing a serum based on your blood. It's a long process, but it's our only chance." As the scientists worked, Jonathan watched them with a mix of curiosity and unease. He had never imagined that he would find himself in such a situation. He was just a regular guy, a soldier who had seen his share of combat. This was no battlefield, but the stakes felt even higher. These alien beings, their lives hanging by a thread, were looking to him for salvation. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but his thoughts kept drifting. What if it didn't work? What if his blood wasn't the answer? He had no way of knowing. All he could do now was trust Talus and the other Valerie scientists and hope that something, anything, could stop the plague. Hours passed as they worked, and finally, Talus looked up from the monitor with a relieved expression. "We've isolated a key component," she said, her voice full of excitement. "It's an adaptive protein in your white blood cells. This protein acts as a defense mechanism, allowing your immune system to rapidly adjust to new diseases. If we can replicate this protein and introduce it into our own cells, we may have found a solution." Jonathan couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment, despite the danger. "So it's not just the blood itself, it's this protein inside it." Talus nodded. "Exactly. We've never seen anything like it before. It's what makes humans so resilient." Jonathan sat back in his chair, processing the information. He was no scientist, but he understood the importance of what they had discovered. The Valerie might have their answer, and it had come from the most unlikely of sources, him. Talus smiled at him. "Thank you, Jonathan. You've given us hope. You've given us a chance." Jonathan smiled back, though the weight of the task ahead still pressed on him. He wasn't out of danger yet. Neither were the Valerie. But at least for now, they had a spark of hope to hold on to. Jonathan woke up to a strange sound, soft beeping, and the faint hum of machines. His eyes slowly opened, adjusting to the bright lights overhead. He was still in the Valerie laboratory, but the bed beneath him was more comfortable than the cold, hard chair he had been sitting in yesterday. The procedure had taken hours, but exhaustion had finally caught up with him, and he must have fallen asleep. Talus stood at the foot of the bed, her eyes focused on a glowing display screen. When she noticed Jonathan stirring, she smiled. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm yet filled with purpose. "I hope you rested well." Jonathan rubbed his eyes, still feeling a little groggy. "I didn't expect to fall asleep. What's going on?" Did you find something in my blood?" Tallis nodded, her expression serious. "Yes. The results are even more promising than we thought. We've isolated the adaptive protein, and we're preparing to synthesize it. If everything goes according to plan, we will have the first prototype of a serum soon." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't truly understood the importance of his blood until now. The Valerie were working to create a cure using what they had learned from his immune system. It felt strange to think of his blood as a weapon, something that could save lives. But in that moment, he understood just how critical this was. "But how long will it take?" "You said it's a long process," Jonathan asked, sitting up in the bed, feeling a little lightheaded. Tallis met his gaze. "We don't have much time. The plague is spreading faster now. We need the serum soon, or we may not be able to save enough of our people." Jonathan's mind raced. He had seen what disease could do in his own world, but this was different. The Valerie weren't just facing an illness, they were facing extinction. He could feel the weight of their desperation pressing down on him, but for the first time since he had crash-landed on their planet, he felt a sense of purpose. His blood, his very existence, was the key to their survival. "I'll do whatever I can to help," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "If this serum can save you, then let's make sure we finish it." Tallis smiled again, her eyes reflecting the gratitude she felt. "Thank you, Jonathan. We're starting the next phase of the process. Once the serum is ready, we'll need to test it on a small group of our people." Jonathan nodded. "And what if it doesn't work?" Tallis' face hardened, though she tried to keep her calm. "We don't have that option. If the serum works, we'll produce enough to distribute it to everyone. But the first test is crucial. We need to be certain before we can use it on the population." The thought of putting a small group of Valerie at risk weighed on Jonathan's mind, but he knew that it was the only way to make sure the serum would work. There was no other choice. As the hours passed, Jonathan was kept busy with tests and more blood samples. The Valerie scientists worked tirelessly, running calculations, analyzing data, and preparing the serum. The laboratory buzzed with activity, a mix of hope and anxiety in the air. In the afternoon, Tallis approached Jonathan again, this time with a small vial in her hand. It was filled with a clear liquid, glowing softly under the lights. She handed it to him carefully. "This is the serum," she said. "The first batch. It's based on the protein we isolated from your blood. We're ready to begin the trial." Jonathan held the vial in his hand, staring at the liquid inside. It felt like holding the fate of an entire race in his palm. This small vial could be the answer they had been searching for. But what if it didn't work? What if all of this, his blood, their efforts, their hopes, was for nothing? "Who will you test it on?" Jonathan asked, his voice soft. "We've selected a small group of volunteers. They are healthy, but they have been exposed to the virus. We need to see how the serum reacts to the disease." Jonathan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew the risks, but he also understood that this was the only way to find out if the serum would work. "Do you think it will work?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tallis met his gaze. "I believe in the data, but until we test it, we can't know for sure." The moment of truth had arrived. As the sun began to set outside the laboratory windows, the Valerie gathered in a central meeting room. Jonathan followed Tallis and Kiran to the front, where several volunteers waited. These were brave souls who had agreed to risk their lives for the chance to save their people. Jonathan's heart went out to them. One by one, the volunteers stepped forward. Each of them was injected with the serum, their faces filled with a mix of hope and fear. The room fell silent as they waited for results. Jonathan watched closely, his mind racing. If this didn't work, if the plague continued to spread, would it be too late for the Valerie? For several tense minutes, nothing happened. Then, slowly, one of the volunteers began to move. His face, which had been pale and weak, flushed with color. His breathing became steadier, and he looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "It's working," Talus whispered, a mixture of disbelief and joy in her voice. Jonathan exhaled, the weight lifting from his shoulders, if only a little. The serum was working. But the battle was far from over. The Valerie had won the first small victory, but the plague was still out there. Jonathan knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. The Valerie weren't finished yet. They could fight back. The news spread quickly through the Valerie city. The serum was working. Jonathan could feel the shift in the air. The hope that had once been a fragile thread was now growing stronger, like a seed taking root in the soil. The volunteers who had received the serum were recovering. Their symptoms were fading, their strength returning. The plague that had once seemed unstoppable was now retreating. But despite the positive results, Jonathan knew that the work wasn't finished. The Valerie still needed more serum, and they needed it fast. The disease was still spreading, and if they didn't act quickly, they could lose the advantage they had gained. Jonathan stood in the laboratory, watching as Talus and the other scientists worked tirelessly. The machines hummed, processing the data from the trials. Every test brought them closer to a solution, but there was still much to be done. Talus walked up to Jonathan, her face tired but determined. "The first batch is a success, but we need to produce enough serum to save everyone. We've learned a lot from the volunteers, but now we need to scale up production." Jonathan nodded, understanding the urgency in her voice. "How long will it take to make enough?" Talus hesitated. "It depends on how quickly we can synthesize the protein and replicate it in larger quantities. We have the process down now, but it will still take time." "Time we don't have," Jonathan muttered under his breath. Talus's expression softened. "I know, but we're making progress. We just need to keep pushing forward." As the days passed, the team worked nonstop, running test after test to refine the serum. Jonathan was involved in every step, helping to guide the process however he could. He had never imagined that his blood would become the center of such a desperate effort, but he knew that he couldn't turn his back on the Valerie now. They had given him a place when he was stranded on their world, and he had to repay them. During one of the late-night sessions, as Jonathan and Talus stood together looking at the data, he turned to her with a question that had been on his mind for days. "Talus," he said, his voice quiet, "do you think there's more to this? I mean, why is it that my blood is so different from yours? I'm just a human. It doesn't make sense." Talus sighed, her eyes drifting to the screen in front of her. "We don't know for sure. Your immune system seems to react to the virus in ways ours doesn't. Perhaps it's because humans and Valerie evolved in different environments, or maybe it's something in your genetics that makes you more adaptable. Whatever the reason, your blood is the key to saving us. I can only hope that we can replicate what it's doing for you." Jonathan thought about this, trying to understand. He had always known his species had its flaws. Every human did, but to be the answer to another species' survival, that felt both humbling and overwhelming. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered, more to himself than to Talus. "You didn't have to," Talus replied softly, "but you're here now, and you've already done more for us than you can imagine." As the evening wore on, Jonathan stepped outside for a moment to clear his mind. The cool air felt good against his skin, a reminder that there was still life beyond the sterile walls of the laboratory. He stood on the balcony, looking out over the vast city, the distant lights flickering like stars. The Valerie were a proud people. Jonathan had learned that much. They had their own rich culture, their own history, and yet they were facing a crisis that threatened everything they had built. And here he was, a stranger in their midst, playing a part in their survival. It felt strange to be at the center of something so important. But then he thought of the people who had volunteered for the trials, the ones who had risked their lives for the chance to save their people. He thought of the families, the children, the elderly who had no choice but to wait and hope. The weight of the task ahead became heavier, but there was still hope. And with it, there was a chance. The next morning, Jonathan and Talus were in the laboratory again. The Valerie had gathered in groups, preparing for the next round of tests. Jonathan's role was crucial. He had to stay with the scientists, monitor the production, and help as needed. He was no expert, but the Valerie trusted him. He had become part of their fight. "Are we ready?" Jonathan asked, looking at Talus. She nodded, a determined look on her face. "We're ready. This is the test that will determine everything. If the serum works on a larger scale, we can begin mass production. If it fails," Jonathan didn't need to hear the rest. He knew the stakes. The lives of the Valerie depended on the serum. It had to work. The tests began, and for hours, Jonathan watched in silence as the Valerie volunteers were injected with the new version of the serum. It was a tense time. The team worked quickly, analyzing the reactions, monitoring the volunteers closely. Jonathan could feel the anxiety in the air. Every minute counted. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Talus turned to Jonathan with a smile. "It's working. The serum is stabilizing in their systems. We're going to be able to save them." Jonathan exhaled, the relief flooding through him. They had done it. The Valerie had a cure. But even as he felt the joy of their success, Jonathan knew this wasn't the end. The war against the plague was far from over. There was still much to do. The Valerie would need to distribute the serum to every corner of their world, and there would be many more challenges ahead. But for now, there was hope, and that was something worth fighting for. The atmosphere in the Valerie city had changed. Hope, once a fragile thread, had grown into a strong, pulsing force. The serum was working, and the Valerie were beginning to recover. However, the battle was far from over. The plague still raged in the far corners of the planet, and time was running out. Jonathan stood in the heart of the laboratory, his mind buzzing with the enormity of what they had accomplished and the even greater task that lay ahead. The scientists had successfully synthesized the serum, and it had saved the first group of volunteers. But now, they needed to distribute it to the masses. The Valerie couldn't wait any longer. Talus was busy at her workstation, communicating with different cities across the planet. "We're ready to begin distribution," she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "The serum is effective, but we need to move quickly. We can't afford to waste any time." Jonathan nodded, trying to stay focused. He had played a part in creating the serum, but now it felt like he was standing on the edge of something bigger. The fate of an entire species rested on the next steps. "We have enough serum to start with," Talus continued, "but we don't know how fast we can produce it in larger quantities. We'll have to take it one city at a time." Jonathan glanced at the screen displaying the global map of Valerie cities. Red dots marked areas where the plague was the most severe. They were everywhere. The task seemed impossible, but there was no other choice. He could see the determination in Talus's eyes. She was willing to risk everything to save her people. "I'll help however I can," Jonathan said, his voice firm. He had come to care about the Valerie, especially Talus, who had been with him through everything. She had been a guide, a partner, and a friend. Talus met his gaze and smiled. "We need you. You are the reason we have this chance." As the first batch of serum was distributed to the affected cities, Jonathan and Talus traveled with a team of Valerie volunteers. They moved quickly, their ship racing through the skies as they made their way to the most infected regions. Jonathan could feel the tension in the air as they approached each city. The hope they carried with them was fragile, and one misstep could send everything crashing down. When they arrived at their first destination, the scene was grim. The city was nearly empty, with only a few survivors staggering through the streets. The virus had claimed most of the population, leaving behind an eerie silence. Talus and Jonathan, along with a team of medical experts, went to work immediately. The serum was injected into the survivors, and within hours, their symptoms began to subside. Jonathan watched as the Valerie people slowly regained their strength, their faces lighting up with hope. For the first time in weeks, there was a sense of relief in the air. But not everyone was saved. Some were too far gone, their bodies too weakened to respond to the serum in time. The loss was heavy, and Jonathan felt it deeply. It was a reminder that the plague had claimed more lives than they could count. But there was no time to mourn. They had to keep moving. For the next several days, they traveled from city to city, injecting the serum into every willing participant. It was exhausting work, but Jonathan couldn't stop now. The Valerie needed him. They needed the serum, and they needed it fast. As they moved from one city to another, the effects of the serum became more and more evident. People were recovering. The death toll was slowing down. The hope that had seemed distant just days ago was now a tangible reality. But then, a new message came through. It was from Kiran, the lead researcher who had been working tirelessly in the laboratory. His voice was filled with urgency. "Jonathan, Tallis, you need to return to the lab immediately. We've detected a new mutation of the virus. It's evolving faster than we anticipated." Tallis's face turned pale. "A mutation? But we've been testing for any changes. How could this happen?" "I don't know," Kiran replied. "But we've seen it happen before. The virus is adapting to the serum. If we don't find a way to stop it, everything we've worked for will be for nothing." Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. A new mutation. Was this the end of their fight? He turned to Tallis, seeing the same fear in her eyes. They had come so far, but now they were facing a new enemy. A stronger enemy. "We have to go back," Jonathan said, his voice resolute. "We have to stop this before it spreads even further." Tallis nodded, her determination returning. "We won't let it end like this." As they boarded the ship to return to the lab, Jonathan's mind raced. What if the mutation was more deadly than the original virus? What if the serum couldn't stop it? They had to act fast. Back at the lab, the atmosphere was tense. The scientists were already at work analyzing the new mutation. Kiran greeted them with a grim expression. "We've run initial tests, but we don't have answers yet. The virus is changing, and we're not sure how to keep up." Jonathan felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had thought they were on the verge of victory, but now it seemed like they were facing the beginning of a new battle. The virus had evolved, and they had no idea how to stop it. Tallis stood by his side, her voice steady. "We'll find a way. We have to." Jonathan nodded, even though uncertainty gnawed at him. The Valerie had already been pushed to the brink, and now this new threat had emerged. But he couldn't give up, not when so many lives were on the line. They had come this far. He wouldn't let them fall now. The laboratory was filled with an intense energy as the Valerie scientists worked quickly, analyzing the new mutation of the virus. Jonathan stood near the back of the room, watching them. The air was thick with uncertainty. They had faced so many obstacles, and just when they thought they had found a solution, the virus had evolved, presenting an entirely new challenge. Time was running out, and Jonathan could feel the pressure mounting. Tallis was beside him, her brow furrowed in concentration as she studied the data on the large screen in front of them. Kiran, the lead researcher, paced nervously, his mind racing for a solution. Everyone was on edge, trying to figure out how to stop the virus from continuing its rapid evolution. "We have to adapt the serum," Kiran said, his voice filled with frustration. "If we don't, the mutation will continue to spread, and we'll be back at square one." Jonathan's heart sank. They had come so far. The serum had worked, saving so many lives, and now it felt like it was all slipping away. He couldn't accept that. The Valerie had fought too hard, and he had to believe that there was still a way forward. Tallis turned to Jonathan, her eyes filled with determination. "We're not giving up. We will adapt the serum. We have the technology, the knowledge, and most importantly, the will to fight." Jonathan nodded, but he still couldn't shake the doubt in his mind. What if they couldn't adapt fast enough? What if the mutation had already outpaced them? Jonathan, Talus said, her voice steady, I need you to trust me. We've been through worse before. We can do this. Her words had a calming effect on him, and for the first time since the mutation was discovered, he felt a flicker of hope. The Valerie were resilient. They had survived so much already. This was just one more challenge to overcome. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. The scientists worked nonstop, analyzing the mutation and adjusting the serum's formula. Jonathan stayed close to Talus, offering whatever help he could. He wasn't a scientist, but he was part of the team, and he couldn't sit idly by while the Valerie fought for their survival. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kieran called for their attention. We've done it, he said, his voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. We've adapted the serum. It's stable, and it should work against the new mutation. Jonathan's heart raced as he heard the words. This was it. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The Valerie had a chance. A real chance. Talus stepped forward, her face a picture of focused determination. Prepare the first batch. We need to get it to the cities immediately. Jonathan watched as the team quickly went to work, the atmosphere in the lab shifting from tense to hopeful. The serum was ready. The solution was within reach. Now, all that was left was to distribute it. The team boarded their ship once more, flying across the planet to the most affected cities. Jonathan's mind was still reeling from everything that had happened, but he knew that this was their final push. If the serum worked, they could save the Valerie. If it didn't, all their efforts would be in vain. When they arrived in the first city, Jonathan couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. The streets were empty, the once bustling city now quiet and ghostly. The plague had ravaged it, leaving behind nothing but devastation. Talus and the team immediately began administering the new serum. Jonathan watched as the Valerie survivors received their doses, their faces showing signs of exhaustion, but also a glimmer of hope. Would the serum work this time? Would it be enough? As the hours passed, Jonathan stayed with the survivors, keeping watch. Slowly, the results began to show. The first few people who had been injected with the new serum started to recover. Their breathing steadied. Their strength returned. A sense of relief filled the air. The serum was working. It was working against the mutation. Jonathan felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had done it. The Valerie were going to survive. He turned to Talus, who was watching the progress with a quiet smile on her face. We did it, Jonathan said, his voice filled with emotion. We really did it. Talus nodded, her eyes glistening with pride. We did. But it's not over yet. We have to continue the fight. There are still many cities that need help. Jonathan nodded. He knew the work wasn't finished. The Valerie had come a long way. But they weren't out of danger yet. They had won a major battle, but the war against the plague wasn't over. Over the next few days, they continued to distribute the adapted serum, and one by one, the cities began to recover. The Valerie people who had been on the brink of death were now standing tall, their strength returning. The plague was retreating, its grip loosening with every passing day. Jonathan stood at the edge of the last city they visited, looking out over the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the land. The sky was clear, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace. The Valerie were recovering. They had survived. As Talus joined him, Jonathan turned to her. What happens now? Talus smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. Now we rebuild. We take what we've learned and make sure we're prepared for whatever comes next. Jonathan felt a sense of accomplishment, but he also knew that this wasn't the end of his journey. The Valerie had become his family, and he would always stand by them. They had faced the worst, and together they had overcome it. The fight wasn't over, but for now, the Valerie had won. And with that victory, there was hope. Hope for a brighter future. Hope for a new beginning.